Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, left the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written in Deuteronomy 8:3, man shall not live by bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." We all remember this time when Jesus quoted chapter and verse and put the devil in his place. There's only one problem. That never happened. Now, to be clear, Jesus did quote from Deuteronomy 8:3, and he quoted it accurately. And he did put the devil in his place. But he did not quote the chapter and verse numbers. In fact, no one in the Bible ever did. Now, many of us have a favorite verse, and even some of us who have never gone to church know some verses. So how is it that Jesus and the prophets never used the Bible numbers? Didn't they know the Bible? Yes. Jesus and even other teachers of his time knew the Bible very well, much better than we do today. So what's going on? How did we get here? First of all, I want to mention a couple of things about why I wanted to make this video. We've all looked up verses using this numbering system, but I'm pretty sure most Christians wouldn't know where it came from. These people who have searched for verses easily hundreds or thousands of times just don't know. And if we were to ask them a question like, did God give us the Bible with all these verse numbers? Many of them would not know what to say, or they might even get nervous about it. But at the same time that all that's true, Christian scholars basically all know the answer, but it never comes up. And typically, they only mention it briefly in the context of discussing another topic. I've never seen anyone explore this topic for its own sake. So let's look into the numbering of the Bible. This is the Great Isaiah Scroll, and it is an amazing manuscript for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's very old, and that is a very good thing. There are a number of reasons why it's good for a document to be very old, but we're always looking for the oldest manuscripts, and the more old manuscripts we have, the better. And this one is from around the 2nd century BC. Now, that is an approximate date, and that applies to a lot of the manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it could be off 50 or 100 years, but regardless, this is a very old document, and it was written before the time of Jesus. And that is very significant because the book of Isaiah has a lot of prophecies about Jesus, and we know that these were written before he was born. The second reason is that the Great Isaiah Scroll is a very complete document. It's one big scroll, and it contains the entire book of Isaiah. And the book of Isaiah is not just any book. It's a big book, and it contains 66 chapters. In fact, it's in the top 10 longest books in the Bible. Now, most of the very old manuscripts are just fragments, little pieces here or there that contain a word or phrase. But this contains pretty much the whole book of Isaiah. In addition to this, the Great Isaiah Scroll is in very good condition, and it's easily readable. Now, of course, there are some missing letters, but for the most part, it's really not that bad. And it's written in a way that can be easily read. The ink is very legible. And so this is an amazing thing, especially considering the age of this book. This makes the entire book of Isaiah one of our most well-supported and provably ancient books. Now, look at this page from the Great Isaiah Scroll. Where are the numbers? Do you see any? Now, maybe you aren't sure because it's written in this ancient Middle Hebrew script and you can't read it. But even if you could read it, you would not see any numbers. And this is the way it is with all of our most ancient manuscripts. The numbers simply are not there. So let's talk about the history of when the numbers were added. The chapter divisions were added first, and this was done around 1228 AD. Then, several hundred years later, the verse numbers were added around 1555 AD. This is shockingly late. And it's not that there's anything inherently wrong with this being so late. I mean, better late than never. But most of history, they had the scriptures without numbers. And that is even true if we are talking about Christian history since the time of Messiah. Once the chapter and verse numbers were added, it seems that they were quite popular because they were adopted universally. And this is not something that we should take for granted. After all, there were many different streams of Christianity all over the world, and there still are. And by that time, there were Christians in the Middle East, in Asia, Africa, and Europe. On top of this, Rabbinic Jews also used the Bible, and these groups often disagree on many things. In fact, some of these groups might even want to choose a different system of numbering just to make themselves stand out as different. With all that in mind, it is perhaps surprising that in the vast majority of cases, the numbering is the same. Now, rabbinic numbering is occasionally different, and this can affect both chapters and verses, but more commonly it affects verses. The best example of this is in the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms contains a number of different songs. Basically, each psalm is a song, and there are 150 of them. For those of you who are familiar with the Psalms, you'll know that they usually start with a little intro text. And these are some examples of some of them. A psalm of David, when he fled from his son Absalom. For the director of music, with stringed instruments, a psalm of David. For the director of music, for pipes, a psalm of David. Christians typically do not treat these lines of text as part of the psalm or part of the song itself, so they've decided that these should be left before the first verse and that the first verse starts with the first line of the psalm. So as a result of this, in Christian translations, you will have this introductory text, which is part of the biblical text, but is not given a number. On the other hand, it appears that the rabbinic authorities decided that that just wouldn't do, and that they wanted numbers for every bit of text. So what this means is that in many of these cases, they added verse numbers to the beginning of these introductory phrases. Some of the Psalms do not have such an introductory text, and so in those cases, verse 1 will start with the beginning of the psalm for both the Christian and rabbinic texts, and there will be no difference in the numbering. In some cases, the introductory text will be very short, and in those cases, the rabbinic text just squish it into the beginning of verse 1. But in these cases, where the introductory phrase is a sentence or more, really anything more than a few words is too much to squish into the first verse of the psalm, and so they will tend to make it the first verse by itself. And in those situations, there will be a numbering difference between the rabbinic text and the Christian texts. And because there are so many psalms, there are actually 150 psalms in the book of Psalms, and because there are so many of them, this results in many psalms where the numbering is different between the Christian and rabbinic texts. So in this video, we talked about the early manuscripts and how they don't contain any numbering, and the history of when these numbers were added. We also looked at some of the differences between Christian texts and the rabbinic Jewish texts in terms of their numbering. In the next video, we will look at some of the places where the numbering matters and how we should think about all of this.